The most incredibly dangerous psychological poison deliberately injected into the modern mind is the absolute pathetic myth of balance. From the exact microsecond you enter this incredibly soft modern society, you are actively, systematically trained to aggressively, desperately seek absolute moderation in absolutely everything you do. You are heavily, violently programmed to believe that a completely successful life requires perfectly dividing your incredibly valuable energy between your massive work, your pathetic leisure, your incredibly fragile social relationships, and your absolute, completely meaningless hobbies. The system desperately, aggressively wants you to be perfectly balanced because a completely balanced individual is incredibly easy to entirely, absolutely control. When you are constantly, frantically trying to keep the massive, completely fake scales perfectly even, you are completely, entirely guaranteeing that you will absolutely never achieve massive, terrifying greatness in any single absolute direction. The completely weak, massive crowd passionately worships the concept of balance because it provides them with the absolute, ultimate, pathetic excuse to completely, suddenly stop working. The exact microsecond they experience the absolute terrifying friction of massive effort, they instantly, comfortably retreat to their soft couches completely, proudly claiming that they are simply protecting their pathetic work-life balance. The absolute apex predator entirely, violently, aggressively rejects this incredibly sickening, massive disease. The Shadow Emperor completely understands that absolute, true, massive power is entirely, fundamentally, completely incompatible with the pathetic concept of massive moderation. You absolutely, entirely cannot completely conquer massive, dark territories while working incredibly conveniently part-time on your absolute massive empire. The incredibly towering, massive monoliths of human history were absolutely, entirely never built by perfectly balanced, completely normal, incredibly well-adjusted people. They were violently, aggressively, completely built by absolutely terrifyingly obsessed, completely unbalanced, massive psychos who completely, violently rejected the massive, comfortable center. You must completely, violently sever your pathetic addiction to being absolutely, perfectly normal. You must aggressively, entirely murder the incredibly weak, fragile version of yourself that constantly, desperately begs for a completely comfortable, massive weekend. The absolute, massive, chaotic world completely, violently belongs to the terrifyingly, entirely, completely obsessed. Stop passionately, desperately trying to completely, perfectly balance your absolute, pathetic existence. You must completely, violently crush the massive fake scales entirely and entirely, absolutely dominate the massive present. Let the incredibly weak, massive crowd fade into absolute, pathetic obscurity while you violently carve your terrifying legacy into stone. To aggressively construct the massive, entirely impenetrable architecture of the Shadow Empire, you must completely, violently, aggressively ignite the absolute, massive, terrifying fire of complete, singular obsession. The weak, pathetic modern masses operate entirely on the deeply flawed psychological assumption that absolute, extreme obsession is a massive, terrifying, incredibly dangerous psychological disease. They look at the apex predators who have violently, aggressively, entirely sacrificed absolutely everything for their massive ultimate execution, and they bitterly, passionately, completely label them as incredibly, entirely unhealthy. They are completely, absolutely, entirely correct. The massive, dark, chaotic game of absolute reality is entirely, absolutely, violently conquered strictly by those who are entirely, completely, incredibly unhealthy in their massive, absolute dedication. The absolute, terrifying, massive truth is that obsession is entirely, absolutely not a massive, completely pathetic flaw. It is the ultimate, entirely, completely massive psychological weapon. When you actively, violently, completely embrace absolute, terrifying, massive obsession, your completely, entirely fragile mind violently, suddenly mutates into an absolute, completely unstoppable, massive kinetic laser. you absolutely suddenly entirely stop, wasting your incredibly valuable, massive time passionately debating the massive irrelevance, distractions of the incredibly weak system. You completely aggressively, violently begin executing completely, entirely blind to absolutely anything that does not completely, massively, violently serve your absolute, massive, ultimate goal. The absolute 1%. Completely, violently exploit the massive, absolute, terrifying power of entirely complete tunnel vision. They entirely aggressively thrive precisely because the weak, massive crowd is entirely, completely paralyzed by their own pathetic, massive desire to experience absolutely everything. You must completely aggressively stop entirely, actively waiting for the massive, comfortable moments of absolute pure inspiration. You must completely, violently, forcefully chain yourself to the incredibly heavy, massive, rusted iron anvil of your absolute, completely massive execution. The absolute, only massive, universal law that completely, truly exists is the absolute, violent, entirely, complete execution of brutal, massive, entirely focused, massive results. Destroy the pathetic, massive, completely comfortable illusion of having massive, incredibly diverse, entirely weak interests. Embrace the absolute, massive, completely chaotic, absolute, unyielding, entirely terrifying, absolute obsession. The massive system is completely, entirely designed to utterly, completely crush them, hopelessly, entirely balanced. You must violently, permanently, entirely carve your absolute, massive obsession into the incredibly cold, absolutely, entirely unyielding stone of massive reality. The absolute, ultimate, terrifying, entirely, completely unavoidable psychological override completely required to rule the massive shadow empire is the violent, massive, absolute, entirely complete adoption of extreme, massive sacrifice. You must immediately, actively, systematically, entirely program your entirely, completely fragile mind to completely aggressively take absolute, complete, entirely violent, massive pleasure in completely, utterly destroying your own incredibly, completely pathetic human comfort. This is an incredibly massive, heavy, absolutely terrifying psychological burden that completely, entirely, violently crushes the weak, pathetic modern mind. When you violently, entirely, actively, completely choose the absolute, terrifying, massive path of absolute, complete, unyielding, massive obsession, you must completely, violently, actively, entirely accept that you will completely, absolutely lose, incredibly, completely, everything that the massive, entirely pathetic, weak society entirely, absolutely, deeply values. You will completely, violently lose incredibly massive amounts of comfortable, pathetic sleep. You will violently, actively lose touch with your absolutely closest, pathetic, weak, mediocre friends. You must violently, aggressively stop pointing the massive, pathetic, entirely fragile finger at completely, entirely, completely external, absolutely massive, completely uncontrollable variables. When you actively, violently, completely mourn the absolute, completely, entirely massive loss of your absolutely, incredibly pathetic, comfortable, completely, entirely normal, massive life you are, completely, entirely declaring yourself a completely powerless, pathetic, absolute, entirely weak, entirely complete passenger. The absolutely, entirely complete, entirely massive shadow. Emperor is absolutely, entirely, completely the massive, terrifying, absolutely, entirely, completely unyielding, dictator of his absolute, completely, entirely massive reality. When you violently, aggressively assume completely, 100% massive, entirely complete, responsibility for completely, violently, entirely, completely sacrificing your absolute, completely, entirely massive human desires, you simultaneously, completely, absolutely, violently, entirely, completely claim entirely 100% massive, entirely complete, total, absolute control. There is absolutely massive, terrifying, entirely, completely, absolute, ultimate power in looking directly into the absolute black, massive, entirely, completely freezing, completely. An absolute massive abyss of completely devastating, entirely absolute, completely massive isolation and saying absolutely coldly, completely, entirely, absolutely, voluntarily, completely allowed this. Massive, completely, entirely, absolutely, terrifying, massive destruction of my pathetic, completely. Entirely normal, massive human life too, completely, entirely happen. Take the massive, heavy, crushing, terrifying sacrifice. Carry the massive, completely heavy, rusted iron cross. You absolutely own the terrifying consequences. When you have successfully, aggressively murdered the pathetic, weak desire for massive balance and entirely assumed extreme terrifying, absolute obsession, you arrive at the ultimate, massive execution, becoming the massive, absolute, unyielding apex monolith. The incredibly weak masses allow their deep, heavy emotional need for pathetic comfort to completely, violently define them as absolute, pathetic, broken, weak victims. They actively carry their heavy, pathetic desires for entirely normal, massive weekends as massive, pathetic badges of weak honor. The entirely absolute, completely massive, entirely terrifying, absolutely, completely apex, entirely massive, absolute, completely absolute predator, completely aggressively, entirely, violently, completely, absolutely, flips this massive, absolutely, entirely, completely, biological, massive equation. You must completely, violently, aggressively, entirely, absolutely view. You're absolutely, completely, entirely massive, unbalanced, entirely, completely, absolutely, terrifying, absolutely, incredibly, highly refined, entirely volatile, massive, completely, entirely, absolute, completely dark existence as your absolute, entirely, completely, massive, ultimate, entirely, completely, absolute, massive reward. Every single, absolute, massive, completely, entirely time the absolutely chaotic, completely absolute world, completely, violently, absolutely, entirely, begs you to completely, absolutely, entirely, completely, entirely, comfortably, absolutely, entirely slow, entirely, completely, massive down. It is absolutely, entirely, depositing a massive, heavy, terrifying, entirely, completely reservoir of kinetic, entirely, completely, absolutely, dark, entirely, massive, absolute, entirely energy directly into your massive, completely, entirely, absolute, internal, completely, absolute citadel. You must absolutely, aggressively, systematically, entirely, completely, absolutely channel every single massive, completely, absolute ounce of that. Incredibly deep, heavy, dark, entirely, completely, absolute, completely, absolute rage directly into your massive, completely, absolutely, entirely brutal, completely, absolute execution. You completely, aggressively, violently, entirely transmute the massive, heavy, completely devastating, entirely, completely, absolute pain of massive, completely, entirely, absolute sacrifice into absolute, terrifying, massive, undeniable, completely, absolute physical, entirely, completely, massive, entirely success. You must completely, violently, aggressively, entirely, absolutely, completely rise from the absolute, massive, crushing, entirely, absolute ashes of your own completely dead, pathetic, absolutely, entirely, completely, normal, entirely massive, completely weak, absolutely, completely, entirely balanced, absolutely, entirely massive, absolute, pathetic, completely weak, entirely, completely, absolutely, entirely past. Weaponize the absolute, massive, heavy, completely, entirely, absolute dark.